I struggled a long time before writing this video because I didn't and honestly still don't think that I can summarize one of the deepest and most gruesome books in history in a short form video like this one. Given the importance of the topic, however, and the fact that some of you might never get to know Victor Frankl's work at all if not for videos like these, I decided I will try my best to summarize Man's Search for Meaning's main points with the clear recommendation that you should pick up the book for yourself. For now, however, let's start at the beginning. So, Man's Search for Meaning is based on the observations of the psychiatrist Victor Frankl based on his experiences in the German concentration camps, and he split those experiences into three different parts. The period following the admission to the camp, the period entrenched in camp routine, and the period following release and liberation. While the period after the prisoner's admission was mainly characterized by shock, the very first reaction might actually surprise you. Frankl outlined that the shock at the apparent atrocities was preceded by a phenomenon he called the delusion of reprieve, which describes the tendency to deny the impending doom until it is actually realized. And this illusion manifested itself by a focus on every little shred of hope that could be found, be it a prisoner laughing and smoking a cigarette, only to find out later that he belonged to a special privileged group called Capo, or a SS guard who was nice and charming, at least as long as the prisoner still had a watch on his hand that the guard wanted him to hand over peacefully. With the realization of doom coming closer, the delusion of reprieve was followed by a grim sense of humor and a sense of cold curiosity about the life ahead before the actual shock set in. And describing this shock is where a video like this can't accurately represent reality. Paraphrasing Frankl to the best of my ability, I would say that the prisoners were incredibly frightened at everything that was going on at first, but at another level the shock also alleviated the prisoners' fear of death, seeing it as some kind of relief. It might seem very strange that fear of death is not one of the main characteristics that accompanies the first shock, but as Frankl explains it, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. In light of this citation, it becomes a little clearer why almost every prisoner considered suicide as a way out in the period following the admission. That's especially understandable because living oftentimes required grotesque choices like trading in your last breath for a shard of glass, to shave your beard and look fitter in order to avoid selection for transport to the gas chambers. Those who survived the admission period anyways, however, were soon confronted with something like a routine within the camps. After a few days, the initial shock was replaced by a state of apathy, best described by the following passage of the book. While in the first phase, newcomers would still look away if a group of prisoners was tortured, the prisoners in the second phase would not avert his eye anymore. His feelings were blunted and he watched unmoved. Even the emotional reaction to death was replaced by some kind of cold rationalism, which was reflected in prisoners taking the useful remains from a fresh corpse for themselves, like a pair of wooden shoes, which was better than their own. Frankl saw this kind of apathy as a necessary psychological shield which served two major purposes. The first of those purposes was to develop an insensitivity even towards the physical pain of daily or even hourly beatings. And while hourly beatings are definitely gruesome enough by themselves, Frankl described the mental agony caused by the injustice and unreasonableness as even worse. And the second purpose of apathy as a psychological shield was to focus all emotions and remaining energy on preserving one's life. While emotional apathy best described the prisoner's reaction to the circumstances of the outside world, Frankl also writes about a whole different side of the everyday camp life, which was characterized by retreating from one's terrible surroundings into a life of inner riches and freedom. The main method that Frankl described in detail was the sacred mental image of loved ones. He reported thinking about his wife very often and described her mental image as more luminous and more real than the rising sun, even if he could not even be sure if she was still alive. This observation that love is going even beyond the physical existence of the beloved person led Frankl to the conclusion that it is the ultimate and highest goal to which people can aspire, and that salvation of man is through love and in love. And I don't know about you, but in a time where the tension between men and women are so strong due to ideologically colored movements like radical feminism or the red pill community, I think a message like this is more important than it ever was. Another salvation that Frankl talks about is the experience of the beauty found in nature and art. This is beautifully reflected in a story told by Frankl, where a prisoner went towards a group of fellow prisoners and asked them to stand up and witness the sunset, even though they just sat down after a full day of brutal physical labor. And in addition to the beauty of nature, the beauty of art was integrated into prison life by people forming improvised cabarets that included songs, poems, and even jokes. These cabarets were so popular that some prisoners even missed their daily portion of food to attend them, which I find astonishing because Frankl already proclaimed that people valued survival over anything else. That in turn might mean that under some circumstances, the beauty of art was more important to survival to people than food. This brings me to maybe the most important part of the book, which is the relationship between the meaning of life and the survival in the camps. Because Frankl wrote that only prisoners who could persevere some form of human dignity and self-respect could preserve their feeling of being an individual with inner freedoms and personal value, as opposed to being part of an animal-like mass of people. And I think it is understandable that the beauty of art is immensely important for that, considering the apathy that prisoners had to develop to shield themselves from pain and the emotional impact of the death all around them. Understandably, however, Frankl reports that very few people achieved this task of persevering their human dignity, but the ones that did proved to him the last and most important human freedom, which is to choose one's own way in any given set of circumstances. This freedom could be seen in a few prisoners who would even give away their last breath for somebody who needed it more, proving that the sort of person a prisoner became was not only the result of camp influences, but also a question of inner decisions. According to Frankl, this sort of spiritual freedom is what makes life meaningful in the first place, because it shows that there is no set of circumstances, not even life in a concentration camp, which completely robs people from their ability to make decisions themselves. He draws a parallel to everyday life, where even an incurably sick patient can find meaning in his suffering by accepting fate in a courageous and dignified way. So how exactly were those few prisoners able to find meaning in their suffering? They did it by reconceptualizing their seemingly meaningless existence in the camp. For example, Frankl himself regularly imagined himself to hold lectures about the psychology of the concentration camps in front of a large audience that could profit from his knowledge. A man who in contrast attached meaning to the outward circumstances could be seen to deteriorate as soon as those circumstances changed. The death rate around Christmas evening, for example, strongly increased because many people attach their meaning to the hope of being home at Christmas. And the antidote to a fate like this is captured in my favorite quote from Victor Frankl. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. In my opinion, taking this sentence to heart is the most essential step in finding meaning in your life, because the meaning of life can never be found in some vague philosophical statement, but in life itself. And if you really think about it, life itself is also not exactly vague, but a very concrete day-to-day experience. And I think this point is even better to understand in looking at the life of prisoners after liberation. Because while you could think that a liberated prisoner was going mad from joy and filled with a sense of meaning from overcoming their situation, the reality was that most prisoners completely lost their ability to feel pleased and were oftentimes ashamed because of it. Additionally, many liberated prisoners became instigators of willful and cruel force over others, justifying their behavior with their own terrible experiences. And aside from this phenomenon, which Frankl described as moral deformity, liberated prisoners were confronted with bitterness about the indifference of people about their experience, and delusionment because after liberation, prisoners felt that they must have reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering, only to realize that suffering has no limitations. As Frankl himself puts it, we were not hoping for happiness, yet we were not prepared for unhappiness. So what we can see here is again the context dependency of the meaning of life. While in camp, all a prisoner wanted was to survive the gruesome situation they were in. survival was their meaning to life. However, right after liberation, that meaning was fulfilled and replaced by another one. The meaning of overcoming the psychological trauma that was inflicted on them by overcoming moral deformity, bitterness, and disillusionment. Finding and embracing this meaning, however, is incredibly difficult, of course, which is why Viktor Frankl developed his own form of therapy called logotherapy. And if you would be interested in learning more about that, please let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to cover it in another video.